Okay, we're going to talk a bit about sentence patterns. Now, I am going to diverge quite a bit from the way the textbook approaches this. I'm going to go for what I think is a more practical approach. The textbook really tries to simplify this information, and that's okay, but I want to approach this in a way that I think is practical for your writing. So, most often a sentence will begin with the subject, and we've seen this already. Usually the subject is followed by a verb. Sometimes the verb is followed by a direct object, modifying words, or other things that we haven't talked about yet. But we're going to, for now, focus on the most common of sentence patterns, which is subject and verb, the cat ate, and subject, verb, direct object. The cat ate the mouse. These are really common sentence patterns. If you grew up in a primarily English-speaking country, you probably learned these kinds of sentence patterns first. You probably heard them as a child and you slowly absorb them, and this is what is most familiar to your brain. Of course, there are exceptions. So one of the exceptions that I want to talk to you about is passive voice. Now, passive voice flips the order of the sentence components. So I hit the ball, subject, verb, direct object. But what if I move the direct object to the beginning of the sentence? The ball, that is the object of the action, was hit by me. So now the direct object, or the recipient of the action, is no longer at the end of the sentence. The subject is at the end of the sentence, and the subject isn't even really a proper subject anymore. It's come in the form of a prepositional phrase, so that doesn't really work. And the verb's still in the same place, but it's all kind of wonky. And you'll notice that the other thing that happens with passive voice, instead of 4 words, we now have 6 words saying exactly the same thing, but in a more indirect manner. Passive voice can also mean that you switch the order of the direct object and the subject, but then you leave the subject out altogether. So the ball was hit. That's a complete sentence. It appears to contain a subject. It has a verb. It appears to have a direct object, although the direct object's in the wrong place. It's a funny old sentence. That is passive voice as well. So you can see that at the beginning of this course I said, well, a complete sentence has to have a subject and it has to have a verb and it has to make sense. Well, passive voice is a kind of a bit of an exception to that because nothing quite fits into those spots comfortably. So why would we do this thing? This takes longer for the brain to process, for one thing. It's something that our brain has to think about just a little bit harder than a more direct sentence. Well, there's a few good reasons that we would do this. Perhaps we're writing and we really want to emphasize the direct object. Maybe it's the direct object that is the most important part of the sentence. Really, maybe the subject, the doer of this action, isn't as important as the object. Passive voice can also be used to obscure the perpetrator of the action. Now, this can be done quite deliberately to kind of pass the buck. You hear politicians doing this all the time if they don't want to accept responsibility for something. It can also be used when the perpetrator is unknown. So we often see this kind of writing in journalistic writing where, you know, there's been a crime committed and and maybe a knife was involved, but we don't know who the wielder of the knife was, and so the perpetrator is unknown, and it's easier to write a sentence that doesn't have a proper subject in it. When not used deliberately, though, passive voice can be a sign of poor writing. So, as I've already said, it mixes up the order that our brains are more comfortable digesting information with. It also takes more words, it's more wordy. So, if you are going to use passive voice, it's really important that you use it deliberately. So, let's look at an example of that. I broke the window with a ball. Okay, there's all the information and everything's in the right order. The subject, the verb, the direct object. But let's just say I don't really want to accept responsibility for that. So I can write something like, the window was broken after a ball went through it. And now we don't know who the heck did it. And the responsibility is directed away from me. Now, I'm not suggesting that you want to blame someone else for your actions, but this is passive voice can be a tool. It's a tool like any other writing tool, but use it deliberately. Don't just fall into it, because that leads to wordy and just confusing writing. I'm going to approach dummy subjects a little bit differently than the textbook does. And again, I'm going to do this because I want this to be meaningful for what you're learning here. So a dummy subject conveys no real meaning on its own. It simply fills the spot of the subject. Now, there are a number of words that can act as dummy subjects. These words don't always act as dummy subjects, though, so you have to be able to know the difference. So words like there, and there is the most common dummy subject. So if you see a construction like there are, there is, there was, there were, you can be pretty certain that there is acting as a dummy subject. There were 16 cell phones on sale last night. There is a frog in my soup. There are many ways to look at a problem. Those are examples where there is used as a dummy subject. Now, I'm not going to go into the problems with these kinds of sentences and how that can be fixed. I'm going to leave that until later. Questions. Questions turn the order of a sentence around. So it can be useful to think of how a question is a statement as well as a question. So for example, Jamal is singing a solo in the senior recital. That's a statement, that's a sentence. We can change that traditional structure into a question. Is Jamal singing a solo in the senior recital? Here's another one. We have something to contribute. Do we have something to contribute? So if you have a question and you want to find the subject, you can turn the question into a statement, and that will help you. Will you paint the kitchen? What's the subject? Well, if I change that question into a statement, I can figure it out. You will paint the kitchen. Now I know it's you. You are the subject of that sentence. One more, commands. So a command has an understood subject. When you command or you request something, the understood subject is you. Take out the garbage. The subject is you. It's not written there, but it's you. Please forgive me. I am speaking to you. So the subject is you. Never carry your wallet in your back pocket. Again, the subject is you.